The bet was Cassie's idea, which meant it was Leah's problem. That was the consistent logic of their friendship. Cassie generated the ideas with the bright, unstoppable energy of someone who had never once in her 26 years suffered a consequence she hadn't been able to charm her way out of, and Leah, who was more careful and more tired and more aware of the specific weight of consequences, found herself agreeing anyway, not because she was weak, because Cassie's ideas, for all their chaos, had a way of arriving at exactly the moment when Leah's careful life needed something to crack it open. The careful life, at present, looked like this: a studio apartment in the Riverside district that cost $1,100 a month and had one window facing a brick wall, a job at an architectural preservation firm that she had wanted badly and now merely endured, photographing and cataloging old buildings for records that no one would look at for 50 years. A savings account that was technically growing and practically insufficient. A social life that had contracted over the past 2 years from something expansive and unpredictable to something she could schedule in a planner, which was either maturity or the beginning of disappearing, and she was no longer certain which. The bet was simple. Spend one night alone in Harrow Manor. Leah had photographed Harrow Manor 14 months ago for the firm's preservation catalog. She had walked every room in daylight with a camera and a tripod and 2 cups of coffee, and had found it exactly what it was: a very large, very old, very empty house on 12 acres of overgrown grounds at the edge of the city, technically owned by a heritage trust that had been managing its slow decline for 30 years. 3 stories. 22 rooms, a reputation that had accumulated the way reputations accumulated around old, empty houses, from the specific human need to put a story in a space that seemed too full of silence to be merely empty. People said things about Harrow Manor, that lights appeared in the upper windows, that groundskeepers hired to maintain the property left without explanation, that the Heritage Trust's annual inspection team always completed their survey faster than the building's size required. Leah had found none of this in her 14 months of cataloging. She had found plasterwork in exceptional condition for its age, original floorboards that had survived without warping, and a kitchen garden at the rear of the property that had gone spectacularly wild in the manner of things left to their own logic for decades. She had also found something she hadn't cataloged: a feeling, specific to the Upper East Corridor, of being in a space that was attending to her. Not threatening. Not cold. More like standing in a room where someone had recently been, where the air had not yet settled back into vacancy. She had noted it the way she noted things she couldn't use professionally, carefully, privately, placed in the category of things that were real but couldn't be submitted in a preservation report. She had not told Cassie about the feeling. She told Cassie yes to the bet at 11:30 on a Friday night at the end of a long week, over the second glass of wine that she normally didn't have, and Cassie had clapped her hands with the delight of someone who had just won something before the game officially started. $200, Cassie said. You stay till sunrise. I'll pick you up at the gate. Done. Leah took the $200 seriously because she needed it, and she took the dare seriously because she had been photographing old buildings for 3 years and was not afraid of the dark. And she did not take the feeling she'd had in the Upper East Corridor seriously because she had made a policy of not taking things seriously that she couldn't explain in a preservation report. She arrived at Harrow Manor at 11 p.m. on a Saturday. She had packed practically: sleeping bag, thermos of coffee, 2 sandwiches, extra camera battery, her smallest tripod, a paperback she probably wouldn't read, and a flashlight she definitely would. She had dressed in layers. The late October air was sharp, and the Manor's heating had not functioned in 30 years. She stood at the iron gate with her pack on her shoulder and looked up at the facade and felt what she always felt when she saw the building: the specific aesthetic satisfaction of something built with complete conviction. Every proportion exactly intentional, the kind of architecture that knew what it was. The gate was unlocked. She had the Heritage Trust's blanket access key from the firm. She had not expected the gate to already be open. She stood with her hand on the iron and looked at the gap and told herself that groundskeepers had keys too, that the trust conducted visits, that there were a dozen explanations for an unlocked gate that required no elaboration. She pushed it open and went in. The path to the front door was stone, edged with what had once been box hedging and was now a loose suggestion of hedging, plant geometry relaxed into pure growth. Her flashlight caught the edges of it. The manor ahead was dark, all of it. Every window in the darkness was the particular quality of buildings that have been empty long enough for the darkness to feel resident rather than incidental. The front door was also unlocked. She stopped on the step, pushed the door open with 2 fingers. It swung without resistance, without sound, which was wrong. She had cataloged this door, had noted the hinge condition, had recorded mild corrosion that should have produced exactly the groan that period films always used as shorthand for this precise moment. The hinges had been oiled. She stood in the doorway and shone her flashlight into the entrance hall. The light moved across marble floors, high plasterwork ceiling, the dark rectangles of doorways leading deeper into the house. Everything exactly as she'd cataloged it, plus one thing she had not cataloged, could not have cataloged 14 months ago, because it had not been there. At the far end of the entrance hall, on the side table below the large gilt mirror, there was a single candle burning. Leah stood in the doorway for 10 full seconds. Then she stepped inside. She told herself there were explanations. The Heritage Trust conducted visits. Someone had been here recently, an inspector, a contractor, a member of the board who had a sentimental attachment to the property. Someone had left a candle burning. It was irresponsible and mildly dangerous, but it was not impossible. Old buildings attracted people with old attachments and old habits, and candles were not supernatural. She walked toward it. Up close, the candle was expensive beeswax, the kind that burned clean, set in a heavy brass holder that was neither dusty nor tarnished. Alongside it, something else she hadn't seen from the door. A small folded card, heavy cream stock, no envelope. She picked it up. 2 words, in handwriting so deliberate it was almost architectural. Come up. She stood with the card in her hand for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then she took out her phone and called Cassie. Cassie answered on the second ring, which meant she was awake and waiting, and had probably been refreshing her messages every 10 minutes since Leah went in. There's a lit candle in the entrance hall and a note that says "Come up," Leah said without preamble. Cassie made a sound that was half delight and half alarm. Are you serious? I'm holding the note. Oh my God. Is it the ghost? It's not a ghost. Ghosts don't source premium beeswax candles. She looked at the card again. Someone has been here recently. Should you leave? She considered the question genuinely. She was a practical person, and a practical person's honest assessment of the situation was, unknown person in old building, directed note, no visible threat, gate and door unlocked in a building that should be locked. The practical response was to leave. She thought about the $200. She thought, in a way that surprised her by arriving unbidden, about the feeling in the Upper East Corridor, the attending quality, the air that had not yet settled. I'm going to see what's up there, she said. Cassie's voice pitched up slightly. Call me in 20 minutes, or I'm calling the police. I'll call you in 20 minutes. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up the candle in its holder. She went to the staircase. The staircase was grand in the particular way of houses built by people who understood that the way you moved through a space told you what kind of person you were supposed to become inside it. Wide treads, a banister of dark wood turned in complex patterns. Portraits on the wall alongside the ascent, faces she had photographed and catalogued, men and women spanning what looked like 3 or 4 centuries. The family line visible in the recurring sharpness of certain features, the particular way certain eyes held light. She went up. The upper landing was long, and the flashlight and candle between them made the darkness retreat to the edges, and the doors along the corridor were all closed, except one. Halfway down. Left side. Upper east corridor. She stopped. The open door framed a rectangle of warmer light, not artificial firelight. From inside, the amber flicker of something burning in a hearth. She could feel the warmth from here. She walked toward it. She stopped in the doorway. The room was a study, large, with bookshelves on 2 walls, a desk near the window, a fireplace with a real fire burning in it, actual wood, recently laid, the logs still carrying their full structure, newly lit. 2 chairs near the fire, positioned with the natural ease of furniture that had been used rather than staged. Books on the desk, open, a glass with something dark in it on the side table, and in one of the chairs, a man. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who had been still for a long time and was entirely comfortable with it. Long, dark hair, loose past his shoulders. Sharp features lit by the firelight in ways that made them more themselves rather than less the angle of the jaw, the line of the brow. Dark clothing, formal but not costumed. His hands rested on the arms of the chair with a looseness that was not carelessness, but the physical expression of someone who had not been startled. He was looking at her. He had been looking at the doorway before she filled it, which meant he had known she was coming, had been waiting with his face already arranged toward the threshold, and his expression when she appeared was not surprise. It was the particular relief of a specific expectation confirmed. She should have been afraid. She noted that she was not afraid in the way she noted things that were real, but couldn't be submitted in a report. She was alert. She was calculating. She was aware of the door at her back, and the phone in her pocket, and the specific distance between herself and this man who should not be here. She was not afraid, he said. I wondered how long you'd stand at the gate. His voice was low and unhurried. The voice of someone who had learned that silence was not an enemy, and words were worth taking time with. It carried the slight weight of an accent she couldn't immediately place, not quite British. Not quite anything she recognized, something older than current geography. You could see the gate from here? She said. He glanced toward the window. From the upper window, yes, he looked back at her. You stood for 47 seconds before you pushed it open. She filed that away alongside everything else she was filing. I didn't know anyone was here. I know. The candle and the note suggest otherwise. He was quiet for a moment. Then, those were for you specifically, not for the general case of someone arriving. He paused. Please come in. There's another chair. You've been in this room before. She had been in this room before. 14 months ago. Tripod and camera. 2 cups of coffee. She had photographed these shelves, this desk, the fireplace that had been cold and dark. She had stood in this room and felt the attending quality most strongly of anywhere in the house. She walked in. She did not sit immediately. She stood near the fireplace because it was warm, and she had been standing in the October cold, and the warmth was a physical fact that required no explanation or trust. She said, "Who are you?" He looked at her steadily. "My name is Aldrich." He said it the way people said names they had been using for a very long time, worn smooth from long use, all the self-consciousness long since gone out of it. "Do you live here?" In a manner of speaking. She looked at the fire, at the open books on the desk, at the glass with the dark liquid, at the quality of occupation in the room, the specific evidence of habitation, not recent visit, but ongoing residence. The kind of settled presence that accumulated in rooms slowly, over time, the invisible layering of repeated inhabitation. "Yes or no," she said. "Do you live here?" He considered the question with a seriousness that suggested he found the question genuine. "Yes," he said finally. "Though the form that living takes here is somewhat different from what you might mean by the word." She looked at him directly for the first time since entering the room. In the firelight, his eyes were an unusual color, dark at the center with something lighter at the edges, the inverse of how eyes normally worked in low light. She said, "I'm going to sit down." "Please," he said. She sat in the second chair. The fire was between them and to the side, and the light it gave was the warm amber of something old and constant and she could see his face clearly, and he could see hers. He made no movement toward her. He sat in the same position he'd been in when she entered, loose hands on the chair arms, fully present without leaning forward, and she recognized in that posture the specific discipline of someone who understood that proximity was a decision that belonged to the other person. She said, "You said you'd been waiting for me specifically." He said, "Yes." She said, "Explain that." He did. He spoke the way the house felt, with a quality of depth that was not performance, not decoration, but the simple character of something that had existed for a long time and had stopped needing to make itself understood quickly. He told her about the house first. Harrow Manor had been built in 1683 by a man named Edward Harrow, whose name was now the first thing Leah thought of when she thought of the property, but who had, in the actual architecture of the thing, been secondary. The man who had designed it, who had lived the first years of it, who had given the rooms their proportions and the garden its original logic, was not Edward Harrow, but a man engaged by Harrow to manage the estate, a man whose name appeared in the original documents as Aldrich, without surname, in the manner of certain periods when surnames were still a class distinction. She was very still. "The same Aldrich," he said without drama, simply as a statement of fact, as though the sentence were, "It rained last Tuesday." She said that was 340 years ago. Approximately, yes. She looked at him, at his face in the firelight, at the hands on the chair arms, at the absolute absence of performance in any of it, no theatrical weight, no enjoyment of her shock, just a person delivering information they had a long history of needing to deliver carefully, and had learned by now to deliver plainly. She said, "What are you?" He said the word quietly, in the same tone he had said his name, worn smooth, all the drama long since gone out of it. She sat with that. Outside the fire, the room was October cold. She could feel it at her back, the cold of an unheated house, and the warmth from the fire was specific and real, and she was attending to it in the way you attended to physical reality when other reality was reorganizing itself around you. She said, "The Heritage Trust believes this house is empty." He said, "The Heritage Trust has been managing the administrative reality of the house for 30 years. The house itself has always had a resident. The two realities have coexisted without particular friction. Because you keep a low profile. Because I have no need to be seen by people who are not looking for me. And you're saying I was looking for you." He was quiet for a moment. "Not looking," he said, carefully. "Something more specific than looking." He turned his glass in his hand. "I have been in this house for 340 years. In that time, a great many people have passed through it, the Harrow family in its various generations. Servants, visitors, the parade of heritage administrators, and the photographers sent by preservation firms." He paused. "Most people move through old spaces with their attention on the surface. They see what they're measuring, what they're recording." His eyes moved to hers. "You saw something else. The attending quality." He said the two words back to her with the precise inflection she would have used herself, as though he had heard the phrase before, as though he had been waiting for someone to find that specific language for it. "Yes, how do you know what I noticed?" "Because what you noticed," he said, "was me. And I noticed you noticing." She thought about 14 months ago. The Upper East Corridor, the way the air had held something that was more than vacancy. She thought about the way she had filed it under things that are real but can't be reported, and had not mentioned it to anyone, not Cassie, not the firm, not even in the way of a joke. She said, "You've been aware of me since I photographed the building. Since before." He said it carefully. There are people who are sensitive to old spaces, to what remains in them. Not psychic. Not gifted. Simply built with a different aperture than most. They feel the residue of occupation. The way a room remembers being lived in. He looked at her. I've encountered perhaps 6 such people in 340 years. He paused. You were the first who didn't leave immediately. She thought about that. Most people run. Most people run, he confirmed. She looked at the fire. She thought about the $200 and Cassie waiting at the gate at sunrise and a careful life in the studio apartment with the one window facing a brick wall. She thought about the reason she hadn't left the manor immediately, hadn't turned at the unlocked gate or the unlocked door or the lit candle, and she was honest enough with herself to know that it wasn't the $200. It was older than that. She said, "Why did you leave the candle? Because it was October and cold and you would have been standing in the dark, and I have spent 300 years watching people stand in the dark of this house when they didn't have to." She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. It was the most unguarded thing he'd said, and he knew it, and didn't take it back. She said, "I called a friend." "She's going to call the police if I don't check in," he nodded. "That's sensible." She took out her phone. She called Cassie. "I'm fine," she said. "I found the source of the light. It's a person, not a ghost. I'll explain in the morning." She hung up before Cassie could fully process the sentence. She put her phone away. She looked at Aldrich across the fire. She said, "I have a lot of questions." "I know," he said. "I've been waiting a long time to answer them." She stayed in the chair until 4 in the morning. Not because she had nowhere else to go. She had a sleeping bag in her pack, and a thermos of coffee, and a paperback she hadn't opened. She stayed because the conversation had the quality of something she had been waiting to have, without knowing she was waiting for it, the way you didn't know you were hungry until food appeared. He told her about the house the way you told someone about a place you had built and lived in and watched change over centuries, not nostalgically, but with the intimate specificity of deep knowledge. The proportions of the entrance hall had been his decision, not Edward Harrow's. And the reason was acoustic. He had wanted a space that held sound differently, that let footsteps and voices find the ceiling before they dispersed. The kitchen garden at the back had been his design, organized on principles he had learned from a tradition that predated English formal gardening by several hundred years. The Upper East Corridor was the oldest part of the structure, the part he had finished first, the part where his presence was most accumulated. She asked him what that meant, presence accumulated. He thought about it. She was learning, precise with language in the way of someone who had watched language drift over centuries and had developed a specific relationship with exactitude. "The way heat is retained in stone," he said. "A room where nothing has happened is merely a room. A room where a great deal has happened, where a person has lived genuinely, thought hard, felt strongly holds something of that. Not a ghost, not an echo, more like a material record. The stone remembers warmth even after the fire is out." She had been photographing old buildings for 3 years and had never heard it expressed that way, and it was exactly right. Exactly the language for what she had always felt and never been able to articulate. She said, "Is that what I was feeling in this corridor?" "Yes, 340 years of my life are in these walls. You walked into it and felt it, because you were built to feel it." She looked at the bookshelves. 340 years of reading, she said. "That's a lot of books." The flicker at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural precursor to one. "I've had to be selective." She stood and went to the nearest shelf without asking. He didn't stop her. She ran her fingers along the spines, the physical range of centuries, volumes in Latin and French and English across its own evolution, bindings from different eras with the different textures of different craft traditions. She pulled one out, a slim volume, English, the lettering on the spine worn to near illegibility. 1741, she read from the title page. He said, "I was in the middle of that when you photographed the building. I left it here when you came in." She looked at him over the top of the book. "You left the room when I was here?" I withdrew. He said it precisely. I can move through the house in ways that don't announce themselves. I watched you work. For a time. Then you stood in this corridor, and I understood that you felt something, and he paused. I withdrew further. I didn't want to influence the experience. She put the book back carefully. You've been watching people move through this house for 3 centuries, and you didn't want to influence my experience specifically. Yes, why specifically? He was quiet for a moment. Because the sensitivity you have is rare, and the way you responded to it, not with fear, not with denial. He stopped. He looked at the fire. There was something in his face that was not quite the openness of someone who had decided to be transparent, but the expression of someone in the process of deciding, the movement toward it happening in real time. He said, I have been in this house alone for a very long time. Not unhappily. I want to say that clearly I am not a figure of tragedy. I read. I maintain the property. I have a life, by my own measure, but I have also been waiting, without allowing myself to name the waiting, for someone to arrive in this house and see it not the preservation value, not the ghost stories, not the investment potential, but the house itself, as a place where someone has genuinely lived. She stood at the bookshelf and looked at him. He met her eyes. You photographed every room, he said. You spent 4 days here. You cataloged the plasterwork and the floorboards and the garden, and you wrote in your report that the property retained exceptional integrity of original character. He paused, and then you wrote 1 extra line. Not in the official report, in your field notes. She felt very still. How do you know about my field notes? Because you left them. On the 3rd day, when you went to get more coffee from your car, you left your field notebook on the desk in this room. She remembered. She had missed it, had looked for it that evening, had eventually decided she'd left it at the office, and found it 3 weeks later at the bottom of her camera bag. I read 1 line, he said. He looked at her steadily. She will never know I read it, and I won't tell her. He paused. I told you. I am precise with language. She said. What did it say? He said it back to her, in her own words, quietly, with complete accuracy. This room is attended. Something here has been paying attention for a very long time, and it is not waiting for anything in particular anymore. It is simply being. She had written that on the 3rd afternoon, sitting at this desk, and had immediately drawn a line through it and written personal, not for report, and had not thought about it again until this moment. The fire crackled. She said, and then I came back tonight. He said, and then you came back. Tonight. She sat back down in her chair. They looked at each other across the fire with the particular quality of recognition that happened when 2 people realized simultaneously that they were further along in understanding each other than the conversation's length should allow. She said, This is not what I expected from a $200 bet. He said, I imagine not. She said, I have more questions. He said, I know. I'll answer all of them. She believed him. She did not sleep that night. Not because she was afraid she had established fairly conclusively to herself that she was not afraid, but because the conversation was too interesting, in the specific way that very rare conversations were interesting, the kind where you were getting something you hadn't known you needed and couldn't afford to miss any of it. He told her about what 340 years looked like from the inside. Not with spectacle, he wasn't a person who reached for spectacle. She was learning, any more than he reached for drama or performance. He told her the way you told someone about a landscape you had watched change, season by season factually, with affection, with the occasional dry assessment of someone who had seen enough to have perspective. He had watched the city grow toward the house, and then, for reasons of history and geography, stop at the boundary of the property and continue around it. He had watched the Harrow family progress through its generations and dissolve. The last of them a woman named Catherine Harrow, who had sold the estate to the Heritage Trust in 1989, with a clause in the deed that required the property to be maintained, but not converted, a clause whose unusual specificity Catherine Harrow had never publicly explained. He had watched the preservation culture grow up around old buildings, the way the 20th century had gradually developed a conscience about what it was erasing. He had watched a great many things. He had been, in the same period, one person, the consistent fact of himself in this house through all of it. She asked, "Doesn't it feel?" She stopped. He said, "Say it." She said, "Lonely." He was quiet for what felt like a considered time. Then, there are different kinds of solitude. I have learned to tell them apart. He looked at the fire. The solitude of a space with no one in it is one thing. The solitude of a space where you are present but unseen is another. He paused. The second is the harder one. You've been unseen by most people who pass through. Yes, he turned his glass in his hand. There have been exceptions. People who felt the house the way you do. People with whom I have had conversations, real ones, not the surface-level interactions of someone conducting business in an old building. He paused. Not many. What happened to them? They left, he said. They had lives. As they should. He said it without bitterness, with the settled equanimity of someone who had processed the pattern and found a way to hold it that didn't damage him. But you're still here. I'm still here. She looked at him. She was a person who liked direct questions, and she was trying to formulate one, but the thing she was trying to ask was not quite a direct question yet. It was more like a direction she was moving in and hadn't yet named. She said, "What do you want from the people who see the house the way I do?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave every question that deserved it. Initially, he said, "I wanted what any isolated person wants. To be seen, to have the experience of being known." He paused. As I've gotten older, and I am considerably older than I appear, I've come to understand that being seen is only the beginning of something. It's not the thing itself. What's the thing itself? He looked at her directly. You tell me. She thought about the studio apartment, the view of the brick wall, the careful life in the planner, growing smaller. She thought about the specific texture of the last 2 years, the way she had been moving through her own life, with the same surface attention she gave to old buildings, photographing the outside of things, cataloging, measuring, recording, without putting her hands in it. She said, being known by someone who stays. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His expression said that she had arrived at it. She said, "That's what you're waiting for." "That's what I've been waiting for," he said carefully, without allowing myself to call it waiting, "for a very long time." She looked at him across the fire. She was 26 years old, and he was 300 and something, and the firelight was warm, and the house was attending to both of them, and outside it was an October night with a $200 bet at the end of it, and she was aware, with the calm clarity of someone whose careful life had just opened a door she hadn't known was there, that she was standing at the edge of something. She said, "You said you've been waiting for me specifically." He said, "Yes. Not someone like me." Me, he held her gaze. "I have been waiting for the person who writes in their field notes that this room is attended, who doesn't cross it out but only marks it personal, who comes back on a dare and doesn't leave at the unlocked gate or the unlocked door or the candle in the hall." He paused. "That is a specific person. You are that person." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's either the most considered thing anyone has said to me, or the opening of something I should be more careful about." "It can be both," he said. "I've learned that the things worth being careful about and the things worth moving toward are often the same thing." She leaned back in her chair. Outside the windows, the dark had begun the imperceptible shift that preceded dawn, not lighter yet, but different. She was aware of Cassie at the gate at sunrise, of the $200, of the planner and the careful life and the brick wall outside her window. She said, "What happens in the morning?" "Whatever you decide," he said. That part is entirely yours." She looked at the fire. She thought about that for a long time. Cassie arrived at the gate at 6:53 a.m. Leah walked out to meet her in the thin morning light, cold and clear, the grounds of the manor around her, and the specific beauty of things left to grow without instruction, and found Cassie leaning against her car, with the expression of someone who had spent the night refreshing her phone and had a great many questions organized in order of importance. "You look fine," Cassie said. "I am fine. You said you found a person." "I did. In the haunted house." "In the house?" "Yes." Cassie looked at her with the particular focus of a friend who knew her well enough to read the space between her words. "You're not freaked out." "No, she stopped." "Leah, what happened in there?" Leah looked back at the manor. The upper east window was dark. She had left Aldrich at 4:30 when the conversation had reached a natural resting point, not an ending, she understood, but a pause, the kind of pause that assumed continuation. He had walked her to the staircase and stood at the top of it with his hands loose at his sides and said, "Will you come back?" She had said, "I need to think." He had nodded, and in his expression, she had seen the thing she was coming to recognize in him, the patience that was not resignation, but genuine comfort with the process of things taking the time they needed. The specific equanimity of someone who understood that forcing pace was a form of damage. She had walked out through the hall and past the candle, which had burned down to a stub but was still lit. Now she stood in the morning cold outside the gate and looked at the window. She said to Cassie, "Give me the $200. Cassie blinked. "That's it? That's the story?" "Not the whole story, but the rest of it needs more time before I can tell it." Cassie reached into her jacket and produced the cash, which she had brought in an envelope because Cassie was the kind of person who put cash in envelopes for dares, and handed it over. Then she looked at Leah with the specific attention of a person who had been her friend for 9 years, and could identify the particular quality of a Leah who had changed slightly overnight. She said, "You're going back." Leah folded the envelope. "Yes, when?" "I don't know yet." She got in the car. Cassie drove her home without asking more questions, which was one of the reasons they were still friends after 9 years. In her studio apartment, with its one window facing the brick wall, Leah made coffee and sat at her small desk and opened her laptop and looked at the preservation report she had filed on Harrow Manor 14 months ago. She read it through the professional, careful language of someone documenting surface, measuring distance, recording without touching. She read the section on the Upper East Corridor, which said original plasterwork in exceptional condition, evidence of continuous maintenance suggesting possible undocumented habitation. And she thought about what continuous maintenance actually meant, about whose hands had kept those hinges oiled, and those floorboards from warping, and the garden from completely reclaiming the stone paths. She thought about 340 years of being present in a space that the official record described as empty. She opened a new document. She started writing. Not a report. Something else. The kind of writing she did privately. The kind she marked personal and not for anyone. The kind that was how she processed the things that were real but couldn't be cataloged. She wrote for 2 hours. Then she closed the laptop and went to work. At work, she moved through the day with the usual competence that the job required and the slightly different quality of interior attention that meant she was thinking about something else. Her colleague Marcus noticed he always noticed. He was perceptive in the way of quiet people who watched rather than talked, and said, "Over lunch, you look like you found something." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When you find a building that's doing something interesting, you get a specific look." He paused. "You've had it since you came in." She looked at her sandwich. "I went to Harrow Manor last night. The preservation site?" "Yes," he raised his eyebrows. "Is it doing something interesting?" She thought about Aldrich in the firelit chair, about the beeswax candle and the field notes he had read, and the very specific words, "I've been waiting for you specifically." She said, more than I recorded in the original report. She went back to Harrow Manor on Wednesday. Not on impulse, she had thought about it carefully, in the methodical way she thought about buildings, considering what she knew, and what she needed to know, and what the structural logic of the situation required. She had made a list, which was how she knew she was serious. The list was long and specific and didn't include the $200. She arrived at 7 in the evening. The gate was unlocked. The front door was unlocked. In the entrance hall, the same brass holder, a new candle, burning. She stood in the hall for a moment, then called up the staircase. "I'm back." A pause. Then, from above, "I know. Come up." She went up. The study was warm and firelit, and he was in the same chair, a different book open on his knee. And when she appeared in the doorway, his expression was the same as the first night, not surprise, but the specific relief of a specific expectation confirmed. She sat in the second chair. She said, "I have more questions." He closed the book. "I know," she said. "I want to understand the practical reality of what this would mean. Not the philosophical part, the practical part." He said, "Ask me anything." She took out her list. He looked at it. She had passed it across the small table between the chairs, because she was a person who worked better from documents, and she watched his face as he read it. And what she saw there was not amusement or condescension, but the thing she had begun to watch for, and that meant the most to her. Genuine attention. The full weight of his focus on her actual questions, treating them as what they were, which was serious. He looked up. He said, "Some of these I can answer with certainty. Some I can answer with honesty about my uncertainty." And one of them he paused. He set the list down. "One of them I can only answer by asking you something first." She said, "Ask." He said, "What is it that your careful life is missing?" She looked at him. She said, "You read my field notes." He said, "You said this room is attended, and something here has been paying attention for a very long time." He held her gaze. "What I am asking is what you need to be paid attention to." It was the most direct question anyone had asked her in 2 years, and the answer arrived immediately, the way answers did when you had been not asking a question for long enough, that the answer had nowhere else to go. She said, "The inside of things." He waited. She said, "I've been photographing surfaces for 3 years. Recording what's measurable, producing documents about the outsides of things that other people will look at in 50 years. She looked at her hands. "I am very good at seeing what's there. I am not good at," she stopped, "at being in the middle of it." He said, "Yes." She looked up. He said, "That's what this house has been, for 340 years. The inside of things. The part that doesn't appear in the preservation report." He paused. "That's what I can offer. If you're willing to come back." She said, "What does coming back mean?" He said, "It means whatever you decide it means." His voice was careful and certain. "I have learned not to build the architecture before the ground is ready for it." He looked at her. "But I can tell you what I hope it means." She said, "Tell me." He told her. He spoke for a long time, with the same precision he applied to everything, laying out what he hoped for in the organized way of someone who had thought about it extensively and understood that organized thinking was a form of respect. He hoped for company. Real company, the kind that required 2 people to be genuinely themselves, not performing for each other, not managing each other's impressions. He hoped for someone to share the house with, in the way that a house was meant to be shared, used, inhabited, lived in from the inside. He hoped for conversation like the one they'd had the first night, that particular quality of 2 minds finding each other's edges and being interested rather than threatened. He was careful about one thing. He said, "I want to be honest about the asymmetry. I have been here for 340 years, and I will continue for an unknown further period. You are 26, and your life has a shape that is still forming. Any arrangement between us is not symmetrical, and I will not pretend that it is." She said, "What does asymmetry mean in practice?" he said. "It means I won't ask you to give up your life for this house. Whatever this becomes, and I hope it becomes something, it has to be additive, not subtractive. You keep your work, your friend, your apartment. Whatever brings you back here comes from abundance, not from lack." She looked at him. That's an unusual position for someone who just said he's been waiting for a specific person for 300 years. He said, "I've had time to think about what I actually want." He paused. "I want someone who chooses to be here, not someone who has no other place to go." She thought about that for a long time. She came back on Saturday, and the following Wednesday, and the Saturday after that. The pattern established itself without being negotiated, the way patterns establish themselves when two people were both paying attention and neither was trying to control the shape of things. She brought her camera on the fourth visit. Not the professional kit, her personal camera, the smaller one she used for the kind of photography that wasn't for the firm. The images she made because she needed to see things from the inside. She photographed the house differently this time. Not the architecture, not the preservation significant details, but the evidence of habitation. The desk, with its current book. The glass on the side table. The specific way the firelight fell on the chair that was his. The garden in early November, the wild roses holding their structure despite the cold, the stone bench he sat on when she worked in the beds. He watched her photograph and said nothing, which she understood as permission and as something more than permission, as the extension of the same quality she had first felt in this corridor. The attending quality, the fullness of being seen without being interpreted. On the sixth visit, she stayed 2 nights. She slept in one of the upper rooms, not the study. Not because the study wasn't large enough, but because she was still building toward things at the pace they needed to be built. She woke in the early morning with the house around her, the old walls with their 3 centuries of accumulated warmth, and lay in the cold room in her sleeping bag and listened to the building, and for the first time in a long time felt the specific satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She told Cassie about him on a Sunday afternoon in November, at the kitchen table of Cassie's apartment over coffee that kept getting cold because neither of them picked up their cups. Cassie listened with the concentrated attention she gave to things she had not expected and did not know how to categorize. Then she said, "When you say old." "Very old," Leah said. "How very?" Leah told her. Cassie put down her coffee cup. She looked at the table. Then at Leah. She said, "And you're not even a little?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I know what fear feels like from the inside. This isn't it." Cassie said, "What does it feel like from the inside?" Leah thought about the attending quality, about the field notes, about the candle in the brass holder, about the long night of the first visit and the conversation that had been the kind she had been needing without knowing she was needing it. About the garden in November, the wild roses, the stone bench, the particular look on his face when she appeared in the doorway that she had come to understand was the closest thing to involuntary expression she ever saw from him, the unguarded relief of someone whose waiting had been answered. She said, like being inside something rather than outside it, like the difference between cataloging a building and living in it. Cassie was quiet for a moment. Then, "You're going to keep going back." "Yes, and he knows that." She paused, finding the right word, hoping for it without counting on it. He's been very careful not to count on it. Cassie looked at her. That's either incredibly respectful or incredibly strategic. Leah said, "Both things can be true." Cassie picked up her cold coffee. "Just promise me you'll keep your apartment. And answer your phone." She promised. She kept her apartment. She answered her phone. She continued going to work at the preservation firm, moving through the careful, necessary days of the life she had built, photographing surfaces, cataloging structures, producing documents for the future. She continued to lunch with Marcus, who continued to notice when she had found something interesting, and continued to not ask more than she offered. She went to Harrow Manor twice a week, And on each visit the house received her the way houses received people who belonged in them, not with fanfare, not with drama, but with the quiet certainty of stones that had been warm once and retained the warmth. It was Marcus who raised the alarm at the firm. He came to her desk on a gray December morning with the specific expression of someone carrying information they hadn't decided how to deliver, which she recognized because she had learned, from 3 years of working alongside him, the precise architecture of his discomfort. He said, "I need to show you something." He turned his monitor toward her. On the screen was a planning application, the public record, filed with the city, the kind of document she spent her professional life reading. She scanned it quickly. A development firm had applied for planning permission on the Harrow estate, conversion to mixed residential use. 42 units. Application filed 6 weeks ago. She sat, very still. "The Heritage Trust," Marcus said quietly, "is in financial difficulty. They've been managing 12 properties across the city, and 3 of them are structural liabilities." He paused. Harrow is on the list. She looked at the application, at the address, at the development firm's name, which she didn't recognize, which meant it was new money rather than old, which meant it would move quickly. She said, "What's the timeline?" "Decision expected in 6 weeks," Marcus said. The trust would have to formally withdraw the heritage designation before conversion could proceed. He paused. "Leah, do you know something about this property that isn't in the file?" She looked at him. She said, "Yes." She went to Harrow Manor that evening without waiting for her regular visit day. She arrived at the gate and pushed it open, and walked up the stone path with the urgency of someone carrying information they needed to deliver before it settled into its full weight, and she went through the front door and up the stairs without stopping at the candle. He was not in the study. She stood in the doorway of the empty room. The fire was lit. The book was on the desk. Everything exactly as it always was except for his absence, and she felt his absence in the room the way she had first felt his presence, as a change in the atmospheric quality, a shift in the density of the air. She said his name. From the corridor, behind her, "Here." She turned. He was coming from the direction of the east-facing rooms, the older part of the house, the part she hadn't fully explored. He was carrying a lamp in one hand, and his expression when he saw her face was immediate in its attention, reading her the way he read things that mattered. He said, "What's happened?" She told him. He was very still while she talked, the specific quality of his stillness that she now understood as not absence but complete presence, everything directed inward, processing. When she finished, he turned and walked to the window of the study and stood looking out at the dark grounds for a long time. She said, "Did you know?" "I knew the trust had concerns," he said. "I didn't know they'd reached this stage." She said, "What happens if the application is approved?" He said, "Without turning from the window, the house would be demolished or converted. Either way, what it is would not survive." "And you?" A pause, longer than his pauses usually were. "Then, I don't know. I have never been in a position to find out." She looked at his back, at the long dark hair against the dark clothing, the lamp casting amber light over the plains of him. She had been coming to this house for 2 months, and she was aware of what had been building in that time, not the first-night quality of something discovered, but the slower, deeper accumulation of something known. The way you knew a room after you had been in it many times, from the inside, in all its weathers. She said, "I can challenge the application." He turned from the window. She said, "I work in architectural preservation. I know how heritage designations work. I know how planning applications are contested. I have access to the professional and legal frameworks." She met his eyes. If the heritage designation was applied correctly, there are grounds to argue it can't be withdrawn for commercial development. The building has to demonstrate active historical significance, not just architectural significance. She paused. Continuous habitation constitutes active historical significance. He looked at her. "Leah, I know," she said. "I know what I'm saying. To establish continuous habitation, I would have to present evidence of it, which means presenting you. Which means, yes, he said quietly. It means that. She said, are you willing? He was quiet for a very long moment. She watched his expression do what it did, rarely move through several things in sequence. The management falling away, the layers visible. She could see the weight of it. 340 years of a careful, invisible life. The arrangement that had held because it was never tested. The specific risk of becoming known to a world that had, in his experience, tended to respond to the unknown with either exploitation or erasure. She said, I won't do it without your consent. I want to be clear about that. If you say no, I'll find another argument or I'll find none, but this is your decision. He said, why would you do this? She said, because this house is worth keeping. Because what it is worth keeping. A pause. Because you're worth keeping, she said, and I have been very careful my whole life about the things I let matter, but I have decided that this matters. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, yes. The process took 3 months. She had anticipated difficult. She had not fully anticipated the specific architecture of institutional resistance, the way systems designed to protect old things could also be used to erase them, depending on who was operating the system and what they stood to gain. The development firm was well-resourced and well-connected. The Heritage Trust was genuinely in financial difficulty and had made the calculation that the Harrow estate was the most viable asset to liquidate. The planning authority was understaffed and had a backlog of applications and was not, in the default settings of its function, looking for reasons to decline. She built her case the way she built her best work from the inside out. She started with the architectural record. The Harrow Manor preservation file was comprehensive because she had made it comprehensive, and she went back through every document, every photograph, every measurement and note, looking for the threads of evidence for continuous habitation that she had noticed in her original survey, but not elevated. The oiled hinges. The maintained floorboards. The garden, which required active management. She produced a horticultural analysis that established the ongoing maintenance of the kitchen garden as consistent with resident-led care over multiple decades, a pattern incompatible with the Trust's record of only visiting the property twice annually. Then, she built the historical case. This was where Aldrich was essential. He gave her access to everything. 340 years of meticulous record journals, correspondence, accounts, documents he had maintained not from sentimentality, but from the specific habit of a person who understood that evidence was the way the past stayed real. She spent 2 weeks in the study going through it, her laptop and his documents side by side, the fire burning, the house around them, and she was aware as she worked that she was inside something, in the precise sense that she had described to Cassie, not on the surface, not cataloging, but in the middle of it. He sat with her while she worked, reading, sometimes answering questions when she had them, which was often, because the documents were dense and she needed context, and he was the context. There was a quality to those 2 weeks that she would return to later, in memory, as one of the clearest experiences of her life, the firelit study. The documents, the careful voice answering her questions, the specific feeling of doing important work in a place that was invested in the outcome. Marcus helped her with the legal framework. She hadn't told him everything, but she had told him enough that there was evidence of continuous habitation, that the habitation was documentable, that the person involved had been a long-term resident without formal legal recognition of that status. Marcus was a methodical person, and he asked precise questions, and when she answered them as precisely as she could, he built from the answers, without requiring more than she offered. The application hearing was in February. She appeared before the planning committee on a Tuesday morning in a formal presentation that was the most important thing she had prepared in her professional life. She laid out the architectural evidence, first clear, sequential, professionally documented. She laid out the historical habitation evidence, second the journals and correspondence and records, presented as a body of material consistent with a single continuous resident rather than multiple short-term occupants. She presented the horticultural analysis. She presented the acoustic and structural evidence she had found in the original survey that pointed to design decisions made by someone with long-term residential intention. She presented everything except his name and his nature, because those were his to give or not give, and he had not given them, and she had built the case so that she didn't need to. At the end, she said, "This property is not dormant. It is not abandoned. It is not an asset whose historical significance is historical only. It is a living archive. The evidence of continuous human habitation over 3 centuries is present in the physical structure, in the documentary record, and in the maintenance practices of the property. Demolition or conversion would not repurpose a historical building. It would erase an ongoing human story." The committee deliberated for 4 days. They denied the application. She got the notification on her phone on a Friday afternoon and sat at her desk and held the phone and felt the specific release of something that had been held very tightly for 3 months. Marcus appeared at her desk and put coffee in front of her without saying anything, which was exactly right. That evening, she went to Harrow Manor. The gate. The door. The candle. She went up the stairs and into the study, and he was in his chair, and when he saw her face he stood. She crossed the room, and he met her in the middle of it, and she put her arms around him without ceremony or preface, the way you moved towards something when the reason to hold back was gone, and he held her with the same careful particular care that was his characteristic, not gripping, not overwhelming, just the full warm presence of him, solid and real and there. He said her name against the top of her head. She said, "We won." He said, "I know. I felt it." She pulled back enough to look at him. "What do you mean you felt it?" He said, "When something changes for this house, I feel it." He held her gaze. "When the threat lifted this afternoon, something in the walls settled." He paused. "I've been feeling it for several hours." She looked at him and thought about attended rooms and accumulated warmth and 340 years of stone remembering heat, and she thought about her field notes and the specific truth she had written and marked personal and not for report. She said, "You've been paying attention for a very long time." He said, "Yes." She said, "It's your turn to be paid attention to." He looked at her with the full depth of those unusual eyes, the dark center and the lighter edges, and she saw in them the thing she had been watching form over months, the slow opening of something that had been waiting for the right conditions, the specific warmth of a person who had stopped bracing and was beginning to let themselves have the thing they had needed. She reached up and touched his face. He held still. The same discipline of permission, the same choice in every fraction of the movement. She said, "I'm not going to run." He said, "I know." He covered her hand with his. "I've known since the first night." He paused. "The question was whether you would come back." She said, "I came back." He said, "You came back." They stood in the middle of the firelit study with the house around them, old and warm and attending, the walls holding 340 years of living, and the beginning of something new in the amber light. Spring came to Harrow Manor differently than it came to the rest of the city. The city got spring in the way of urban places, sudden, loud, the green forcing itself up through pavement cracks, cherry trees along the avenues going from bare to full in what felt like a week, the temperature fluctuating until one morning it simply wasn't cold anymore, and everyone acted surprised despite the annual precedent. Harrow Manor got spring the way old grounds got it, slowly, from the bottom up, beginning in the kitchen garden where the things she had planted in October were making their first cautious appearances, moving up through the wild garden to the formal hedges, and then to the trees, which took the longest, their old growth roots drawing warmth from deep in the earth before committing to leaf. She moved some of her things to the manor in March. Not all of them she kept the studio apartment as she had promised Cassie, because her life was not disappearing into the house but expanding toward it, and the distinction mattered. But she brought the camera equipment and the design books and the work setup and she set it up in the library at the large central table, which had been her workspace since the beginning, and she arranged it the way she arranged workspaces she intended to stay in, her particular order, her particular light, her particular way of making a surface into the right environment for sustained attention. Aldrich had been in the library when she set it up. He had watched her arrange things with the specific quality of attention she had come to know as his highest form of presence, fully watching, fully quiet, fully there, and when she finished he had said, "This is the third time you've set up in this room." She said, "I know." He said, "The first time you were a visitor. The second time you were returning." He paused. "What's this time?" She had thought about the answer before he asked it, in the way she thought about things that she knew were coming, and she said, "This time I'm staying." He said nothing. He didn't need to. She could read him now, with the fluency of someone who had been paying close attention to a person for months, the movement in his expression that was the unguarded version of him, the thing he didn't manage, the specific warmth that was not performance, but evidence. She worked in the library every day when she was at the Manor, and he read in the armchair every afternoon, with the reliable consistency of someone who had done this every afternoon for decades, and who now had company for it. The quality of the parallel silence between them was different from the early months, less careful, less structured. The silence of people who had established the fact of each other, and were comfortable moving within it. She photographed the garden through spring, not for the firm personally. In the private photography, that was how she processed what was real. She documented the peonies she had planted in autumn, which were coming up now in exactly the spot she had placed them, exactly as slow as peonies always were, the leaves thick and dark and determined. She photographed the roses, which were this spring the best they had been in years. She had been working in the garden all winter, and the work showed. The plants responding with the cooperative generosity of things that had been cared for after a long period without it. She photographed Aldrich, eventually, not to display, not for documentation. Because he was part of what was real, and she needed to see things from the inside, and the inside of her life now included him, specifically, the particular quality of him and the particular quality of this house, and she needed to record it in the way she recorded things that were worth keeping. He was in the garden the first time she photographed him, sitting on the stone bench with a book, mid-afternoon, the spring light finding the long dark hair and the sharp angles of his face, and doing the thing outdoor light did to him, getting through the indoor composure, finding the warmer version underneath. She raised the camera without announcing it. He looked up. He looked directly at the lens with an expression that was steady and open and entirely himself. She lowered the camera. He said, "You can take it." She said, "I know. I wanted to ask first." He said, "You didn't ask." She said, "I was about to." He held her gaze with the faint precursor to the smile. "Then go ahead." She raised the camera again. She took the photograph. She looked at it in the small screen afterward, and it was exactly what she had wanted, not staged, not performed, not the surface of him, but the inside of him. The specific depth of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time and knew how to hold still for it. She showed it to him. He looked at it for a long moment. She couldn't immediately read his expression. Then he said, "I haven't seen myself in a photograph before." She was very still. He said, "Photography wasn't common until the mid-19th century, and by then I was being quite careful about visibility." He paused. "I've seen my reflection, obviously, but not this." He looked up at her, not from the outside, the way another person sees me. She said, "Do you like it?" He said, "I don't know." He looked at the image again. "I look like someone who is paying attention." She said, "You are always paying attention." He said, "Yes, but I didn't know it was visible." She said, "It's very visible." He held her gaze. She saw in his face the particular combination she had come to love most in him, the depth and the warmth, and underneath both of them, the thing she had felt first in this corridor. Before she even knew him, the attending quality. The fullness of being in a space that had been waiting for a long time, and had finally received what it was waiting for. She sat down beside him on the bench. He closed his book. They sat in the spring garden, and she thought about the dare, and the $200, and the first night in the firelit study, and the 3 months of twice-weekly visits, and the planning committee, and the winter, in the library, and all the careful incremental steps of a person who had been building towards something without letting herself name it until it was fully present and real. She said, "I want to tell you something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I know you said that what this becomes should be additive, not subtractive. That I keep my life and this is additional." She paused. "I want you to know that it doesn't feel additional anymore. It feels central." He was quiet. She said, "I'm not saying that as pressure. I'm saying it as information, the same way you gave me information in the beginning." He turned to look at her fully. He said, "I have been careful not to let myself want too much." He said it with the honesty of someone naming a long habit. Because wanting too much from something you can't guarantee has historically been the beginning of the damage. She said, "I know." She met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to stop being careful. I'm asking you to let the evidence update the calculation." He looked at her for a long moment. The spring garden was around them, the peonies coming up from the autumn planting, the old roses gathering their new growth, the manor behind them with its warm amber windows in the afternoon light. He said, "What's the evidence?" She said, "I came back. Every time you let me decide, I came back." He said, "Yes." She said, "So update the calculation." He was quiet. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not the ceremony of the early months, not formal, not structured, not the management of impression, just the simple gesture of a person reaching for the person they wanted to be near. He said, "I want you here. Not because the house needs a resident, not because I've been waiting, because you are specifically you, and being near you is the most real I have felt in a very long time." She said, "That's the most direct thing you've said to me." He said, "I've been practicing." She laughed, the real one, the unguarded kind, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her with the same careful warmth that was his characteristic, and the spring garden was warm, and the peonies were coming up from the earth, and the house was attending to both of them with the full weight of everything it had accumulated, and held, and kept. The summer that followed was the best one she could remember. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the particular richness of ordinary days in a place that felt right, the slow accumulation of a life being lived from the inside rather than documented from the surface. She worked at the library table in the mornings, her design commission spread across the central surface in the deliberate organization of someone who needed visual order to think. She worked in the garden in the afternoons when the light was right, and the garden was responding to a full season of care in the way of things that had been patient for a long time and were now flowering without reservation. She photographed everything: the building, the grounds, the progress of the peonies that were in their first proper year of growth, and were still months from bloom but were present, definitively and beautifully present, in a way that made their eventual flowering feel like something she could wait for. Aldrich was there through all of it. Not continuously, he moved through the house in his own rhythms, the deep familiarity of someone in his own space, appearing and disappearing with the ease of 300 years of practice. But he was there, present in the ways that mattered, at meals, in the library afternoons, in the garden, on the stone bench, in the evenings by the fire, in the study, when the work was done, and there was nothing required except to be in the same room and talk, or not talk as the mood allowed. She brought Cassie in July. She had been building toward it since spring, not because she was uncertain she was not uncertain, but because Cassie was her closest person, and she wanted to introduce these two parts of her life with the care they both deserved. Cassie arrived at the gate on a Saturday afternoon, with sunglasses, and the specific energy of someone who had been waiting for this moment for 7 months and had a great many observations stored up. She stood at the gate and looked up at the manor facade and said, It's beautiful. It is, Leah agreed. Cassie looked at her. You look different. Different how? Like something is open. She turned back to the manor, something that was closed before. They went in. Aldrich met them in the entrance hall with the particular composed attention that was his natural register, and Cassie shook his hand and looked at him with the assessing intelligence she applied to everything she decided mattered, and Leah watched them both and felt the warmth of seeing two things she loved occupy the same space. Afterward, in the kitchen where Leah had learned to make tea on the large old range, Cassie sat on the counter the way she sat on counters and said, "He's extraordinary. Yes, he looks at you like you're the most interesting thing in any room." Leah poured the tea. I know. Does it feel like enough? Being here? Being chosen by someone who she stopped, finding the right words. Someone with that much history. Leah thought about the attending quality, the field notes, the candle in the brass holder. 340 years of stone remembering warmth. She thought about the October garden and the spring garden, and the library afternoons and the single photograph on her camera of a man looking directly at the lens with an expression that was steady and open and entirely himself. She said, "It doesn't feel like enough. It feels like exactly what it is." Which is the right amount. Cassie looked at her for a long moment. Then she picked up her tea. She said, "Okay," she said, "I need you to know I'm glad you went back that first morning instead of taking my $200 and going home." Leah said, "I took the $200. Cassie said, "And then you went back." "Yes, good," Cassie said. "That's what I mean. In September the peonies bloomed. She had been watching for it. The buds had been forming for weeks. Slow and deliberate. The plant taking its time in the way of things that didn't rush toward their own flowering. She was in the garden on a Tuesday morning when she saw it. The first bloom opening, pale pink, the petals unfurling, with the particular softness of something that had been held a long time and was finally letting itself be what it was. She went to find Aldrich. He was in the study with a book, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and she said, simply, "Come see." He came. They stood together in the kitchen garden and looked at the peony, the first bloom of a plant she had put in the ground on an October afternoon the year before, while he sat on the stone bench and asked if she was assuming they'd be here to see it. She had said, "I'm assuming we'll have the choice." She had the choice. She was here. He stood beside her and looked at the bloom and then at her, and she turned and looked at him. And the late September garden was warm and golden, and the manor behind them was full of everything it had always been full of, and now full of something new as well. The specific warmth of a life being lived in it the way it was meant to be lived, from the inside, with full attention, with the willingness to be in the middle of things, rather than cataloging their surfaces. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." He said, "I know." She said, "I want you to know I know it too, not because I have to stay, because I'm choosing to stay." He said, "There's a difference." She said, "Yes, and I'm telling you which one this is." He turned to look at her fully, and she saw in his face the complete version of the thing she had been watching form across a year of visits and conversations and ordinary days and one extraordinary planning committee, hearing the open warmth of someone who had stopped bracing, who had let the evidence update the calculation, who had allowed himself to have the thing he needed. He took her hand. The garden was warm around them, and the old roses were making their final autumn growth, and the peonies were blooming in the bed she had planted, and the house behind them was attending with the full weight of 340 years, and whatever years were still to come, all of it present and warm and real in the September afternoon. She leaned against him. He held her, and the house, which had been waiting for a very long time, was finally, completely, fully home.